C.S. Lewis says about demons, there are two ways to look at them. You can dismiss the thought of them, or you can give them too much weight. The devil delights in both portions. From C.S. Lewis, Screwtape Letters. We discovered so far in studying Luke that Jesus was sent to proclaim liberty to the captives, to give sight to the blind, to set the oppressed free. Later in Luke, he will get to the diseased and the blind, and he'll show later that he has power over the physical sphere as well as the natural world. And now today, he is going to assume control over the spiritual realm. An interesting thing is that there are few examples of demon possession in the Old Testament. But now that we get to the New Testament, now that Jesus is here, it's almost as if Jesus is going to crank up his authority over this world. And if Jesus is going to start exerting his authority over this physical world, Satan is not going to stand by quietly. He is going to start to crank it up as well. That's my viewpoint of why there are more demon possessions that we read about in the New Testament. Because Jesus has now come to kind of shake up things. Things were not going the way they were. In the Old Testament, if you look at how Satan's powers were used, there was a lot of idol worship. There were a lot of other nations that were worshiping Baal and Ashtaroth and these other idols and demons and gods and things. And God spoke through his prophet to the nation Israel. And he told them what was right and what was wrong. He sent the prophets to warn the nation Israel that they need to turn aside those things. But if you look in the Old Testament, we're primarily talking about nations. The nation of Israel, the laws that was given out. The prophets almost always spoke to all Israel. On certain occasion, when they spoke to certain kings and different people, that's because those kings had control of the nation. They were going to send the nation out to battle. So in the Old Testament, it was this Israel against the other nations. But now, when we are coming to the New Testament and Jesus is born, Jesus is going to make it personal. He is now no longer dealing with the nations. We can find, and we will find through the New Testament, through the book of Luke, that Jesus is going to deal with people on a personal basis. So Satan is going to react to that. Instead of reacting by having idols and idol worship and the whole nation going into idolatry, we're going to look at individuals. And if personally Jesus is going to touch lives, then Satan figures he is too. And so here is a turning point in history in the spiritual world. Jesus realized, and so should we, where our real fight is. As a matter of fact, Paul understood where our real fight is. He says in Ephesians 6:12, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of the dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms." That's where it starts, in the realms, in the spiritual powers. It does not stay there. It comes down to earth. And especially what we are going to see as Jesus deals with this demon, that it's coming down to a specific place. Now, the scripture that we read this morning says that then he went to Capernaum, a town in Galilee. On the Sabbath, he taught the people. So you see on the map where Capernaum is. Capernaum became Jesus' home base for much of his ministry. Not Nazareth, where he grew up, certainly not Bethlehem, where he was born, but he centered around Capernaum. That's where he did many of his great works. That's where he kind of went back to relax and so forth. And this is up in the area of Galilee. Jerusalem would be down and to the left. You can't even see it on this map. So this is where Jesus did most of his work, in Capernaum. This is a picture of synagogue in Capernaum. And again, we don't know that Jesus went to this particular synagogue, but these are the places that Jesus would go because that's where people went to hear news. There was not obviously internet or even the postal service, and so they got their news from people who traveled around in the area, and when they came to town, they would go into the synagogue and they would tell what's going on, and then they would read scriptures and so forth. Verse 32, they were amazed at his teaching because his words had authority. So the people in the synagogue that were hearing Jesus were amazed at his teaching because his words had authority. Now, when I study as a pastor, I learn from others. So, in other words, I will go back to some of the great preachers in the past, and I will see what they're saying about this particular verse, the text that I'm going to be dealing with today. See what some of the great theologians have said about this. I read about people, I don't know either Greek or Hebrew, so I defer to those who do. So especially when some of the words matter in that particular passage, I will read what others are saying about the original Greek or the Hebrew. So I learn and I study from others. When I present to you what I present to you in a half an hour each Sunday morning, much of it is not